Before dawn, the transport planes came in low over Tagaytay Ridge, engines droning against a sky still gray with uncertainty. Below them, a city of 1 million people waited in terror, and an enemy garrison had already decided that if it could not hold Manila, it would make sure no one who took it back would ever forget the price. What happened over the weeks that followed would burn itself into the memory of Japanese commanders far beyond the Philippines, not because the 11th Airborne Division was the largest force in the battle. It was not because it fought alone, it did not. It became a name spoken with a particular kind of dread because of where it appeared, how it fought, and what it proved about the reach of an enemy that Japanese planners believed they could still contain. This is the story of an airborne division that dropped out of the sky into one of the most brutal urban battles of the entire Pacific War, and left behind a reputation that outlasted the war itself. By 1945, most Japanese commanders in the Philippines had learned to read American offensives in patterns. Naval bombardment, then landings, then a slow grinding advance supported by armor and artillery, predictable in shape even when devastating in effect. Airborne troops, when they appeared at all, were understood as a narrow, specialized tool, useful for seizing a single objective and then requiring rescue by conventional forces before they could be cut off and destroyed. The 11th Airborne Division did not fit that pattern, and the men who commanded against it would spend the rest of the war recalculating what American capability actually meant. To understand why that reputation formed, you have to understand the trap Manila had become by early 1945. By that point in the war, Japan's position in the Philippines was collapsing. American forces under General Douglas MacArthur had returned to Leyte in October 1944, fulfilling a promise made 2 years earlier under very different circumstances. Luzon, the main island, was next, and Manila, the capital, was the prize both sides understood mattered most. For Japanese command, the calculus around Manila was brutal in its clarity. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding Japanese ground forces on Luzon, had already concluded the city could not be defended and ordered it declared open, intending to withdraw his forces into the mountains rather than fight house to house in a city that offered no strategic advantage once surrounded. But Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commanding roughly 17,000 naval infantry and marines garrisoned in and around the capital, made a different choice. He refused to abandon the city. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It became something closer to a siege-turned-massacre, one that would leave Manila among the most devastated capitals of the entire war. Into that furnace dropped the 11th Airborne Division. Unlike most airborne operations remembered in Western memory, the 11th Airborne's campaign for Manila did not begin with a single dramatic jump into chaos. It began with something quieter, and in its own way, more unsettling for Japanese commanders trying to track American intentions. Elements of the division landed by sea at Nasugbu, south of Manila, on January 31, 1945, achieving near-total surprise against a coastline the Japanese had not expected to be a landing zone. From there, the division began pushing north toward Tagaytay Ridge, a piece of high ground that offered a commanding view toward the capital. On February 3rd, paratroopers of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment dropped directly onto that ridge, linking up with the units already advancing from the coast. Picture that moment from the ground. Japanese observers watching an already deteriorating defensive picture suddenly seeing American parachutes blooming over high terrain they had assumed was secure. It was a small operational moment in the grand scope of the war, but moments like this accumulate into something larger. They tell an enemy commander that the old boundaries of where a battle could reach no longer apply. From Tagaytay Ridge, the division turned toward Manila itself, and the character of the fighting changed completely. South of the capital lay a network of Japanese fortifications that would come to be known as the Genko Line, a belt of concrete pillboxes, buried naval guns, and interlocking machine gun positions stretching for miles, anchored on Nichols Field in Fort William McKinley. It had been built and reinforced for months, designed by naval engineers who understood exactly how much punishment a defensive position could absorb if constructed correctly. This was not a jungle perimeter improvised under pressure. It was a deliberate killing ground, engineered specifically to bleed an advancing force as slowly and expensively as possible, and it was directly in the path of the 11th Airborne Division. Understand what this meant for a unit built and trained as airborne infantry. Paratroopers were equipped and organized for speed, for shock, for operations behind enemy lines where mobility mattered more than sustained firepower. They were not built on paper for the grinding reduction of fortified positions defended by naval guns dug into concrete emplacements. And yet that is exactly what they were forced to become. For days that stretched into weeks, the men of the 11th Airborne fought forward through the Genko Line pillbox by pillbox, bunker by bunker, often at ranges close enough that grenades and satchel charges did more work than rifles. Japanese naval infantry defending these positions had been ordered to hold to the last man, and in position after position, that order was carried out with a grim, absolute literalness. There was no dramatic breakthrough here, no single moment where the line simply gave way. There was only the slow, costly, deliberate work of clearing fortified ground defended by men who would not surrender it. Each bunker taken meant close combat in confined spaces, artillery called in almost on top of friendly positions, and casualties absorbed at a rate that would have broken a less determined force. Picture the terrain itself, flat coastal ground broken by concrete emplacements sunk low enough that they were nearly invisible until a position opened fire. Fields of fire had been cleared and overlapped with mathematical precision, so that any advance across open ground meant crossing lanes where 2 or 3 guns could bear on a single man at once. Engineers moved forward under that fire carrying satchel charges, crawling the final yards to a bunker's blind side because there was no other way to reach it. Radio men called in fire missions from positions close enough to hear the impact before the sound of the shot reached them. Some positions had to be taken more than once, retaken by Japanese defenders emerging from tunnels connecting bunkers that had been marked cleared hours earlier. That alone unsettled American commanders as much as the initial resistance. This was not a line that simply absorbed casualties and eventually broke. It was a line built to keep killing even after it had, by every conventional measure, already been overrun. This is where the deeper meaning of the story begins to surface, and it is worth pausing on because it reframes everything that follows. Japanese command doctrine by 1945 had shifted dramatically from the aggressive offensive posture of the war's opening years. After the string of defeats that followed Guadalcanal, Japanese planners increasingly built their defensive strategy around attrition. The idea was not to prevent American advances outright. It was to make every advance so costly in blood and time that American political will would eventually crack before Japanese resolve did. The Genko Line embodied that doctrine perfectly. It was not designed to hold Manila forever. It was designed to make the cost of taking Manila so severe that the men ordering the next assault and the nation reading the casualty reports back home would begin to question whether victory was worth what it demanded. What Japanese commanders did not fully account for was the specific character of the force they had positioned against that doctrine. The 11th Airborne Division was built from volunteers, men who had chosen the additional risk and additional training of parachute and glider infantry precisely because they wanted to be where the fighting was hardest. That selection process created a unit with an unusually high tolerance for exactly the kind of grinding, costly combat the Genko Line was designed to inflict. Bunker by bunker, the line began to fail. Nichols Field fell after brutal fighting that cost the division heavily, its garrison destroyed almost entirely rather than surrendering the position. Fort McKinley followed, another fortified strongpoint reduced through the same exhausting methodical process. By late February, the southern approach to Manila that Japanese planners had spent months preparing had been broken open, not through some brilliant maneuver, but through sheer, sustained willingness to keep paying the price the line demanded. But the story of the 11th Airborne at Manila is not only a story of grinding attritional combat. It contains one of the most audacious rescue operations of the entire Pacific War, one that revealed a completely different dimension of what made this division so dangerous to Japanese commanders trying to plan against it. Roughly 40 miles south of Manila, at a place called Los Baños, more than 2,000 Allied civilian internees, men, women, children, elderly missionaries, and prisoners who had endured years of captivity, were being held at a camp increasingly threatened by the collapsing Japanese position around them. Intelligence reaching American command suggested the guards might execute the internees rather than allow them to be liberated, a fear grounded in massacres already occurring elsewhere as Japanese forces retreated. On the morning of February 23, 1945, elements of the 11th Airborne executed a raid that combined a parachute assault, an amphibious approach across a lake, and coordinated ground movement by Filipino guerrilla forces, all timed to strike simultaneously while the camp guards were engaged in morning calisthenics, away from their weapons. Picture the scene as it unfolded: paratroopers dropping directly onto the camp perimeter at first light, Amtraks churning across Laguna de Bay carrying more troops toward the shoreline, guerrilla fighters cutting off routes the Japanese garrison might use to reach the internees before American forces could. The entire operation was built around seconds, not minutes, timed with a precision that left almost no room for error. It worked. Within roughly 20 minutes the camp was secured, the majority of the Japanese garrison was destroyed, and more than 2,000 starving, exhausted civilians who had spent years fearing exactly this kind of violent end instead found themselves alive, being carried to safety across the same lake that had nearly become their grave. Consider what those internees had endured before that morning. Years of confinement, dwindling rations that had left many of them dangerously thin, the constant low hum of fear that grew sharper as Japanese fortunes collapsed across the islands, and the risk of a final, vengeful massacre grew with every passing week. For many of them, the sound of parachutes opening overhead in the gray morning light was the first sign in years that the war outside their fences had not forgotten they existed. The withdrawal itself was as dangerous as the assault. Internees, many too weak to walk far, had to be moved across open water under the constant threat of Japanese forces still operating in the surrounding countryside. Amtraks made repeated crossings of the lake, carrying the sick and the elderly first, while paratroopers and guerrilla fighters held a perimeter against a counterattack that could have turned rescue into massacre in a matter of minutes. That it did not happen was not luck. It was the product of a plan built with almost no margin for error, executed exactly as designed. For Japanese commanders studying after-action reports, Los Baños represented something deeply unsettling, a different register of fear entirely from the grinding losses along the Genko line. It showed that this division could strike with near-surgical precision, deep behind what should have been secure territory, coordinating air, water, and ground movement with a level of planning and audacity that suggested American capability had expanded far beyond what static defensive lines could contain. An enemy that can be worn down through attrition is, in a strange way, a known quantity. An enemy that can also appear without warning 40 miles behind your position and dismantle a guarded camp in 20 minutes is something else entirely. It is the kind of capability that makes every rear area feel exposed, every secure position feel temporary. That double character, the willingness to grind forward through fortified lines at brutal cost, combined with the ability to strike with sudden, precise violence far from the main front, is what set the 11th Airborne apart in the memory of the officers who faced them. Meanwhile, inside Manila itself, the battle for the city had become something closer to atrocity than combat. As American forces closed in from multiple directions, Iwabuchi's naval troops, trapped and increasingly desperate, turned much of their remaining violence against the civilian population, killing tens of thousands of Filipino civilians in the final weeks of the fighting. The 11th Airborne, advancing from the south, fought through streets and neighborhoods where the line between military objective and human catastrophe had almost entirely dissolved. This is important to sit with, because it changes the texture of what the men of the division were experiencing as they fought. This was not open jungle warfare against an enemy army alone. It was combat conducted inside a dying city, past the bodies of civilians, through buildings burning from deliberate arson, amid the screams of a population being destroyed by the very garrison that claimed to be defending it. The psychological weight of that environment pressed down on every advance, every building cleared, every street crossed under fire. Soldiers who fought through those neighborhoods later described a war that felt fundamentally different from the jungle campaigns that had come before it. There was no clear front line, no obvious direction from which danger came. Snipers held positions in church towers and apartment blocks. Booby traps waited in doorways. Families sheltering in basements sometimes emerged into the middle of firefights with nowhere safe to run. Every clearing operation carried the added, crushing weight of knowing that behind nearly every wall might be either an armed defender or a terrified civilian, and that a wrong guess in either direction carried a cost that could not be undone. It was warfare stripped of the abstractions that make distant battles easier to comprehend from the outside. The enemy was dug into the same buildings where families had lived for generations. The line between combatant and victim blurred with almost every building cleared, and the men doing the clearing carried that blur with them long after the guns finally went quiet. By early March 1945, Manila had been recaptured, but at a cost that stunned observers on both sides. Much of the old walled city of Intramuros lay in ruins. Estimates of Filipino civilian dead ran well into the tens of thousands, a horror that would leave Manila remembered as one of the most devastated cities of the entire Second World War, alongside Warsaw itself in the scale of urban destruction. For the 11th Airborne Division specifically, the cost was severe by any measure. Casualties that reflected weeks of continuous combat against an enemy that had chosen annihilation over surrender at nearly every fortified position it defended. And yet what emerged from that cost was a reputation that Japanese commanders carried forward into the rest of the war's final year, one built on a very specific and uncomfortable realization. The old assumptions about airborne forces, that they were a specialized tool for narrow tactical moments, brief and vulnerable once their initial shock wore off, had been shattered. Here was a division that had parachuted onto a ridge, fought a sustained grinding campaign through some of the most heavily fortified positions in the entire Philippines campaign, and executed one of the most precise rescue operations of the war, all within the same 6-week window. That combination told Japanese planners something they could not easily defend against. It told them that American airborne capability was not a single-use weapon to be absorbed and then dismissed. It was a flexible, sustained threat that could appear on a fortified line one week and behind their rear area the next, adapting to whatever the situation demanded rather than being confined to the narrow role airborne doctrine traditionally assumed. As the war moved toward its final phase through the spring and summer of 1945, that lesson shaped how Japanese commanders elsewhere began preparing their own defenses. factoring in the possibility of vertical envelopment and rapid deep strike operations in ways earlier planning had not seriously considered. Manila had proven that American forces were willing to commit elite, hard-to-replace units to both attritional grinding and precision strikes within the same campaign, a flexibility that Japanese doctrine, built around static, attrition-focused defense, struggled to answer. There is a particular kind of dread that settles into a command structure when it realizes an enemy can hurt it in more than one way at once, not just through overwhelming force pressed slowly forward, not just through sudden precise violence from an unexpected direction, but through both, delivered by the same division in the same campaign without warning of which form the next blow would take. Military planning depends on categorization. An enemy unit is assessed, filed, and assigned an expected role, and defenses are built around that expectation. A fortified line is built to absorb infantry assaults. A rear area is secured against the assumption that no organized force could reach it quickly enough to matter. The 11th Airborne's campaign for Manila broke both of those assumptions inside the same 6 weeks, and an enemy that breaks assumptions faster than a command structure can revise them is, by definition, a threat that command structure cannot fully plan against. That is the quiet arithmetic behind fear at the command level. It rarely announces itself with panic. It shows up instead as reassessment, as revised planning documents, as commanders who begin building defenses around possibilities they had not previously considered worth the resources. Somewhere in that recalculated planning, in bunkers built deeper and rear areas guarded more heavily than doctrine had once required, the memory of Manila was doing its quiet work. That is the deeper truth beneath why Japanese commanders never forgot the 11th Airborne at Manila. It was not simply that the division won. Divisions won battles across the Pacific throughout 1944 and 1945. It was that this particular division demonstrated a range of capability, from brutal fortified line combat to a rescue operation executed with near-flawless precision, that collapsed the comfortable categories Japanese planners had used to predict American behavior. Return now to that image of transport planes crossing Tagaytay Ridge before dawn, engines droning over a city that did not yet know how much of itself it was about to lose. The men aboard those planes did not know in that moment that they were opening a campaign that would demand everything from them, from brutal bunker-to-bunker fighting through the Genco line to a rescue mission executed with seconds to spare at Los Baños. They only knew their objective and the ridge waiting below. But in the months and years that followed, as Japanese officers who had faced them tried to make sense of what had happened at Manila, that campaign became something larger than the sum of its battles. It became a warning embedded in doctrine, a name attached to a level of capability and resolve that reshaped how an entire military establishment thought about the airborne threat for the rest of the war. Manila itself never fully recovered the character it held before February 1945. Its walled city, its churches, its government buildings, reduced to rubble in weeks of fighting that left scars visible for generations. But amid that devastation, the record of what the 11th Airborne Division accomplished, and what it endured to accomplish it, became something Japanese commanders could not simply file away and forget. It became the proof of a capability they had failed to fully anticipate, delivered by men who had fallen out of the sky onto a ridge above a dying city, and who did not stop moving forward until the city, and the lives it still held, were pulled back from the edge of total ruin.